I'm here with Pastor Doss Sidney, who is the lead pastor at Highland Baptist Church in Kitchener. And he has some exciting things happening in his community despite COVID and everything else. And so, Pastor Doss, thanks for agreeing to be interviewed here today.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about something that happened recently in your church parking lot.
Sure. Well, what we had was a outdoor baptism. We had a young woman who had come to our church just about a year and a half ago, and she called and said, "Well, someone has recommended your church. Could I come to your church?" And she said, "But I'm blind, and could someone meet me?" And we met her and took her to a seat and so on. And then later, about a half a year later, she joined our inquirers class, which was geared towards baptism. And she was on track to be baptized at Easter. But you know what happened in March? There was COVID that came along. And so we had to change our plans about baptism. We couldn't have the baptism. And she said to me late summer, this past summer, she said, I'd really like to be baptized. Is there anything that could be done towards my baptism? And I thought about that. And of course, with having to keep physical distance and wearing a face mask and all that sort of thing, to have it indoors in our baptismal tank, to guide her into the tank without stumbling and so on, would have been a real problem. So I inquired about having a baptism in someone's pool, but by September the water was getting pretty cold, So we said, well, how about having a baptism in our church courtyard? And we decided on pouring, and we had a jug of water, which was warm at the start, but it was a cool day. It was sunny but cool. And by the time we baptized her, the water was quite cold, and you could see the grimace on her face as the cold water trickled down her head, down her face, and onto her. But it was so very meaningful. She shared her testimony, and she said, I just can't stop talking about Jesus." And she shared her testimony, which was so meaningful. And she said, since coming to Christ, I don't fear death anymore. And in fact, when I open my eyes for the first time and see again, the first face I will see is God's face. So very meaningful and beautiful. If you wish, I can tell you more about her too.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about her. Please do share.
Well, um, Shermeen came from a Muslim home, and she said it was a loving Muslim home. But she said with Islam, it governs every part of your life. What you eat, what you dress, what you do, she said was a part of her identity. And she says, even now, when she hears the adhan or the call to prayer, she often is tempted to bow her head and cover her head with a hijab and go to prayer. But she said at university, uh, often happens with our own kids, as there were questions asked about faith and so on. She said faith simply did not make sense to her. She listened to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so on, and she could not accept an interventionist God who seemed angry and wrathful. And she said God seemed more like a sort of adult Santa Claus. And she joined a group called Freedom International. And it's a group that helps Muslims shed their faith and move on. And it's called Freedom Faith. And she said she tried that. She became an avowed atheist. And yet she says there was in her a kind of hunger. And she said, well, even if I don't need God, even if I don't believe in God, do I still need God? Interesting kind of question. And she said at university, as she went into law school, she's she's been called to the bar and she's a lawyer. She said she met three women who were very intelligent and smart women who happened also to be Christian. And she said they were people who did not suspend their intellect. They did not have all the answers. And yet she says somehow there was a dramatic reorientation in her life. And she said the only way she could explain that was that it was the work of the Lord and God's Spirit. She said she was influenced deeply by C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity and some of his thoughts uh, when he says, well, if you're thirsty, it must mean there must be water somewhere. Or if there's hunger for love and intimacy, surely love must exist. She said she's not a very emotional person, but she found in Christianity there could be a place for such a person as her who's not emotional, but emotionally needy. And as I said before, she said she has no longer any fear of dying. And I remember as she closed her testimony, her sharing of her journey of faith, she said something uh, that remains with me. She said, "The first thing my eyes will see is the face of God." What a wonderful thought and insight.
So tell me, I mean, that's an incredible story of faith transformation and new life. How is the ongoing life of your church? I mean, we've all been kind of forced to deal with COVID, and so for lots of us who've been kind of in the faith for a long time, we sometimes don't see the forest for the trees, right? We're so used to it that we don't even see it anymore. How incredible the life of Christ is. So how are the other members of your church doing? How maybe how has this baptism influenced them, or how has the lack of being able to gather together affected your church?
Sure. Yes, we still haven't really fully reopened. There are some activities that are ongoing in the church, and one of the first activities that we opened in the church is our Children's Needs Distribution Center um, that serves our community. And actually, tonight we're having a community dinner where we are giving away meals, and people are coming with their cars, and they're going to pick up a meal. We'll put them in the trunk of the car, and so on. But it's been tough. People who are living on their own find it especially difficult because there's loneliness. And we might try our first service sometime this month, actually, in November. But we've been going online. And in some ways, that is second best, but at least it is something. And we have our regular musicians, and I speak. Incidentally, if people want to see the baptism of Charmaine, they can watch it at our website, Highland Baptist Church in Kitchener, and it was put in the part of the service on September 27th. So we've been putting it on Facebook and YouTube, and people have been watching and responding, and so we know that it has been meaningful. However, we know we're not touching everybody because there are some people who don't have Wi-Fi, and we are thinking very hard about how we can connect with them and somehow let them know that we'd like to connect with them in worship as well. We do have a calling tree, which has been very good, and we have made it a point through the calling tree that everyone is connected by phone at least once a week. And that's been very meaningful, very helpful. Yeah.
That's great. Can you describe more about this calling tree? What does it look like?
Oh, well, um, we have some people in our church who are very good organizers. And some of them were part of a visitation team. And we said, well, we can't really go visiting anymore, but perhaps we can call them. And so they set up a roster of people to use the telephone. And some of the people who are called are callers themselves. And so they have a rotation of people that they call every week. And this way, everyone stays connected and everyone has some contact. It's awfully hard for people who are especially living on their own because sometimes they don't have any human connection at all. and there's only the television. And here is someone they know, someone from their own community of faith who's calling them, expressing concern. And yeah, I think it's very, very good. We're grateful for that ministry.
Yeah, that sounds really important. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us about your church and what's been happening there. And hopefully, you've given some other people some ideas about how they can continue with baptisms, but also how they can connect meaningfully with their congregations, even as we continue to be forced apart.
Sure. Thank you so much. I should have said too, when it came to baptism, we put the emphasis on believers' baptism and not so much on the quantity of water. And it was so very beautiful and meaningful. Thank you. Good to have a conversation with you.